The world as Alex knew it was slipping through his fingers. It started slowly, with rumors of strange occurrences and reports of an infection that spread faster than the authorities could control. News outlets broadcasted warnings, but no one truly believed it. No one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral out of control. It all began on an ordinary morning in the heart of a bustling city. Alex had just finished his shift at the cafe where he worked, tired but eager to meet his friends later. He stepped out onto the streets of downtown, which was already teeming with people rushing about. The sky was clear, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the skyline. But something was off. As he walked to the bus stop, Alex noticed that people weren't looking at each other as they usually did. They were distracted by the chaos unfolding around them. Cars honked, drivers shouting as they swerved and cut each other off. Screams echoed in the distance, but no one seemed to pay them much mind. That was until it came closer. The first sign of the outbreak was the woman running toward Alex, her face contorted in sheer terror. She was shouting something, but her words were drowned out by the sound of nearby sirens. As she drew closer, Alex could see what she was running from, a figure in the distance, limping toward her. The man's body was unnaturally contorted, and his movements were erratic. But it was the blood, black and thick, dripping from his mouth, that told Alex something wasn't right. The woman tried to scream again, but the figure lunged at her, knocking her to the ground with terrifying speed. Alex froze, unable to process what was happening. The scene around him exploded into chaos. People screamed, pushing and shoving to get away, as the figure tore into the woman, ripping and tearing at her flesh. The air was thick with panic and the metallic scent of blood. It wasn't long before more figures appeared. They came from alleyways, from dark corners, and even from the subway stations. Alex watched, paralyzed with fear, as people ran for their lives. But no one was prepared for the madness that was about to follow. The city, once alive with the sounds of traffic and conversation, was now a war zone. As the undead closed in on the crowd, there was no safe place to run. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the street, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. A bus had slammed into a nearby lamppost, and a group of survivors began scrambling out of the wreckage. Alex's instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, desperate to escape the chaos and find shelter. The city's tall buildings, once a symbol of security and progress, now loomed like silent giants over a crumbling world. Alex darted into a nearby building, a worn-down office complex with a shattered glass door. Inside, the hallways were eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the air felt stale. He couldn't be sure, but something told him the building had been abandoned long before the outbreak. It was clear that he was alone for now, but how long would that last? The door to the stairwell was locked, and the elevator didn't respond to the button presses. Alex had no choice but to head toward the back exit. The world outside was a nightmare, and no matter where he went, the undead would be waiting. But there was a sense of security in the building, if only for the moment. He needed to gather his thoughts and figure out a way to survive. As Alex moved through the corridors, he could hear distant sounds of breaking glass and screams outside. The once thriving city was now silent except for the echoes of chaos. He thought of his friends, his family. Were they safe? Were they even alive? Before he could dwell too long on the terrifying thought, he heard a faint noise from the stairwell behind him. The shuffle of footsteps. Not the slow, dragging shuffle of the undead, but the quick, deliberate steps of someone alive. Alex hesitated, his hand tightening around the metal pipe he had grabbed off the floor. He stepped carefully toward the sound, every muscle in his body tensed and alert. Peering around the corner, he saw a figure, a man, seemingly in his late 30s, with wild eyes and a rifle slung across his back. The man was panting, clearly exhausted, but he moved with purpose. His gaze landed on Alex, and for a moment, there was an unsettling silence between them. The stranger's eyes narrowed, scanning Alex for signs of threat. "Are you alone?" the man asked, his voice low and cautious. Alex hesitated before nodding, though a part of him wasn't sure whether to trust this person. The city had turned into a war zone, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. "I need to get out of here," the man continued, his voice growing more urgent. "This place isn't safe anymore. If we don't stick together, we'll end up just like them." Alex nodded, his mind racing. What choice did he have? The city had turned into a nightmare, and survival was all that mattered now. Together, they would have to fight for their lives and navigate a city where the undead roamed free. But for Alex, the journey had just begun. And the real nightmare was only just beginning to unfold. Alex followed the stranger through the darkened corridors of the office building, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The man's sharp movements and urgency were a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the place. Every corner, every creak of the floorboards, seemed to whisper the threat of the unknown. Outside, the city was no longer just a place, it had become a jungle, a hunting ground for creatures that used to be human. The stranger led him toward the back door, a rusted emergency exit that groaned in protest as it opened. A blast of cool night air rushed in, and with it, the unmistakable stench of decay. The streets were a far cry from what they had been earlier that day. Where there had been life and noise, there was now only deathly quiet and broken glass scattered like confetti. Far-off sirens wailed, but they were no longer a sign of rescue. They were the sound of a city unraveling. "You'll want to keep your head down," the man said, his voice low and guarded. "We're not safe out here. We need to find shelter, somewhere we can plan our next move." Alex nodded, still processing everything. He glanced up at the buildings around them, their once towering presence now casting long, haunting shadows. He had always loved this city, the energy, the hustle. But now, the streets that had once felt like home felt foreign, hostile, like a maze filled with dangers that lurked in every darkened alley and behind every corner. The stranger, who introduced himself only as Jack, took Alex's arm and steered him away from the streetlights. Their footsteps echoed softly in the stillness, but Alex could hear the distant, guttural growls from the undead. The city wasn't just a battleground, it was a trap, and every moment they spent out in the open made them vulnerable to the horrors that roamed freely. "I've been on the move for hours," Jack continued, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I tried to get to my family, but the city's locked down tight. No way in, no way out. The military's pulled out, and now it's every man for himself." The air was thick with tension, the fear of what lurked beyond their line of sight pressing down on Alex like a weight. Jack was a man on a mission, and Alex wasn't sure if that mission included him. But there was no choice, survival meant sticking together for now. They rounded a corner and slipped into a narrow alleyway, where a rusted fire escape ladder jutted out from a nearby building. Jack motioned for Alex to follow him as he quickly climbed up, his movements fluid and practiced. Alex hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the street where the shadows seemed to stretch further, and then climbed after him. Reaching the rooftop, Alex took a moment to catch his breath. The view from above was chilling. The city sprawled out below them, a once thriving metropolis now consumed by chaos. Smoke billowed in the distance, rising from the remains of what might have once been a vibrant neighborhood. There was no sign of life, only the stillness of a city in collapse. "What now?" Alex asked, his voice shaky, though he didn't know if it was from exhaustion or fear. Jack crouched beside him, pulling out a set of binoculars. He scanned the city below, his eyes narrowing as he observed the shifting movements of the undead in the streets. "We need to find a safe place to hunker down. The building we're in was a decent hideout, but it's not sustainable. We'll need food, water, weapons, and a place to rest. There's a warehouse district a few blocks away. It might be risky, but it's our best bet for now." Alex didn't argue. The truth was, he had no plan of his own. He wasn't sure what Jack's agenda was, but at this point, he had no other options. The night was closing in, and the dangers of the city were becoming more apparent with every passing minute. Jack stood up, wiping dust from his pants. "We'll move quickly. Stick to the rooftops and avoid the streets. The last thing we want is to be cornered." They began to move along the rooftops, trying to stay low and out of sight. The sound of shuffling feet and low moans carried up from the streets below, but the undead hadn't yet noticed them. Every step they took felt like a gamble. The wind howled through the alleyways, and the occasional crash or scream reminded them that they were far from alone. As they crossed from one rooftop to another, Alex began to feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. The city wasn't just a place, it had become a trap, and they were the prey. But the longer they stayed hidden, the more Alex realized that survival would require more than just avoiding the undead. It would require trust, and trust was something that could easily be shattered in a world like this. "Do you trust me?" Jack asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Alex glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. In a world where betrayal was a constant threat, could he afford to trust anyone? He didn't have time to dwell on it, though. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. As they continued their journey across the rooftops, Alex realized that trust, like survival, was going to be tested with every step they took. The city had become a labyrinth of danger, and the further they ventured into it, the more uncertain their chances of making it out alive became. But for now, they had no choice but to move forward. Each rooftop they crossed, each shadow they passed, felt like another step closer to the heart of the nightmare. They were no longer just running from the undead, they were fighting to hold on to whatever shred of humanity they had left. The city sprawled out beneath them like a shadowed landscape, its once bustling streets now a ghostly reminder of the life that had once thrived there. Alex's eyes never left the ground as he and Jack moved cautiously along the rooftops, their footsteps muffled against the concrete. The distant moans and growls of the undead seemed to echo in the emptiness of the city, the noise both haunting and oppressive. Jack led the way with a quiet urgency, his every movement deliberate as he scanned the area. Alex struggled to keep up, the weight of his fear and exhaustion dragging him down. His mind was racing, constantly jumping from one thought to the next. What was happening to the world? Was anyone else left? And who could be trusted in a city where no one was truly safe? The hours passed, and the moon rose high in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the broken city. They didn't speak much during their trek, each of them lost in their own thoughts, only exchanging terse words when absolutely necessary. Jack's eyes never seemed to stop scanning the horizon, while Alex's thoughts constantly returned to the safety of the warehouse Jack had mentioned. They were getting closer, but the journey had already taken its toll. The sense of unease that had settled in his stomach earlier now festered into something far worse. As they approached an old industrial district, the landscape began to change. The tall buildings that once housed businesses and apartments were now decaying husks. Cracked windows and boarded-up doors were signs of a long-forgotten time, of a place that had been abandoned long before the outbreak. And yet, it was these very structures that now offered them the potential for shelter, even if it meant facing more dangers. "Keep your head down," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "There could be more of them around here. We don't want to make any noise." Alex nodded, his body tensing as they entered the maze of abandoned warehouses. The once organized streets had turned into a labyrinth of concrete and steel, creating a maze that was just as dangerous as the city itself. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the distant growls of the undead seemed to grow louder with every step. They slipped into a darkened alley between two rusted buildings, the shadows swallowing them whole. Alex's breath quickened as he fought to stay silent. Every movement seemed to echo, and every creak of the building made his heart race. He felt as though the walls were closing in on him. As they moved deeper into the alley, a low groan from behind stopped them dead in their tracks. Alex whipped his head around, eyes wide with panic. There, in the shadows, a figure lurked, an undead creature, its body twisted and mangled. Its head jerked toward them, and for a split second, Alex thought he saw its vacant eyes lock onto his. Instinctively, Alex reached for the metal pipe he'd picked up earlier, but Jack's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and holding it firmly. "Don't move," Jack hissed. "It's not alone." The tension in the air was palpable as Alex slowly lowered the pipe, trying to steady his breath. The undead figure was closer now, shuffling toward them with a guttural growl. Jack motioned for Alex to follow him and they quickly crouched, pressing themselves against the cold, hard walls of the alley. Alex's heart was hammering in his chest, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had frozen around them. The figure drew nearer, its steps slow and dragging, as if it was savoring the hunt. Alex's mind raced. How many were out there? How long would it take before they were discovered? The undead's groan grew louder as it approached, its body stumbling erratically. The air felt thick with dread. Alex could almost feel the creature's rotten breath on his skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the rising panic. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature stopped and let out a long, low growl. It turned away, heading down the alley in search of easier prey. Alex exhaled sharply, his muscles trembling with the adrenaline rush. He had never been so close to death, and yet, he had narrowly escaped. "Are you okay?" Jack whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. Alex nodded, though his throat felt tight. He couldn't bring himself to speak, the encounter had left him shaken. It was one thing to hear about the undead and read about the horrors happening outside the city, but to experience it firsthand was something else entirely. Every moment felt like it could be his last. "We keep moving," Jack said, his voice now firm, resolute. "We don't stay in one place for too long. The longer we linger, the more chances we have of getting caught." Alex didn't argue. There was no time for hesitation. They had a mission, to survive, and it meant being one step ahead of the undead at all times. As they continued through the alley, Jack led them to the entrance of an old warehouse. The building was dark, and the large steel doors creaked as Jack pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of old oil and machinery lingered in the stale air. But at least it was quiet, and for the first time in hours, Alex allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Jack set down his backpack and pulled out a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The warehouse seemed endless, rows of old crates and machinery stacked high, creating an eerie silence. They were hidden now, at least for the moment. "We rest here for now," Jack said, settling against one of the crates. "But we can't stay for long. We need to keep moving tomorrow." Alex nodded and sank down beside him, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with the undead in the alley. They were out there, everywhere, waiting for any sign of life. And the more they fought to survive, the more they realized just how high the price of survival truly was. There was no going back to the way things were. Not anymore. The hours spent in the warehouse passed slowly, the stillness of the place pressing in on Alex like a heavy weight. The darkness was oppressive, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of old metal and the distant hum of the wind outside. As he sat against a crate, the faint rustling of his clothes seemed deafening in the quiet. His mind kept racing, circling back to the question that had plagued him since the moment he'd stepped out onto the streets: what had happened to the world? Jack was busy rummaging through his pack, pulling out various supplies, canned food, water, a few makeshift tools. He didn't speak much, but there was an intensity to him, a focused determination that was hard to ignore. Alex couldn't help but wonder about Jack's past, what had led him to this point, to this place in the city where survival was everything. But asking questions felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. In this new world, people didn't have time for small talk. The night wore on, and the warehouse became colder as the hours dragged by. Alex's eyes grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not here, not with the constant threat of the undead just beyond the walls. Jack had told him to stay alert, to be ready for anything. The truth of that warning hit Alex harder than he could have expected. The world outside wasn't just dangerous, it was a battlefield, and they were outnumbered. Suddenly, Jack's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. "We need to move. Now." Alex snapped to attention, his heart leaping in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for the pipe he had set aside earlier. Jack was already on his feet, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the darkened corners of the warehouse. "What is it?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack's gaze locked onto the shadows outside the warehouse doors, his posture tense. "We're not alone." A chill ran down Alex's spine. He had known, deep down, that their temporary refuge couldn't last forever. The city was teeming with threats, both the undead and the living. The ones who had been left behind, those who hadn't found shelter or escape, could be more dangerous than the zombies themselves. And now, it seemed, they were closing in. Without another word, Jack moved toward the back of the warehouse, his movements quick and purposeful. Alex followed him, trying to keep up despite the growing sense of panic gnawing at his insides. They made their way to a small door at the far end of the warehouse, the hinges rusted and creaking in protest as Jack pushed it open. The smell of stale air hit Alex's nostrils, but there was no time to think about it. They had to keep moving. "Stay close," Jack whispered, pulling Alex into the narrow alley that ran behind the warehouse. The shadows stretched long around them, the city's skyline looming overhead like a dark, silent sentinel. They crept through the alley, their footsteps muffled by the debris littering the ground. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around them was eerily quiet, but Alex knew that the calm was only temporary. The undead weren't far away, and there was always the threat of human predators lurking in the darkness. As they rounded a corner, Jack held up a hand, signaling Alex to stop. He crouched low, peering around the edge of a building. Alex followed suit, staying close behind. They watched as a group of survivors moved down the street ahead, 2 men and a woman, all armed and alert. The woman was holding a rifle, her gaze constantly scanning the surroundings. The 2 men carried bats, their faces grim. Alex's stomach churned. Were these people friendly, or were they another threat in a world that was quickly losing all semblance of humanity? Jack seemed to recognize the danger in their posture, his expression hardening. "We can't trust them," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. "They'll take what they want, and they'll do anything to survive." Alex nodded, his instincts screaming at him to stay hidden, to avoid confrontation. But as the group drew closer, Alex's thoughts raced. Would they pass by unnoticed? Would they see them? The tension was thick in the air, the silence almost unbearable. And then, without warning, one of the men in the group spotted them. His eyes locked onto Jack and Alex, and for a split second, the world seemed to pause. "Hey! You too," the man shouted, his voice cold and demanding. "You're not getting away that easily." The group turned toward them, their expressions hardening as they slowly advanced. The woman raised her rifle, her finger poised on the trigger. "Don't move," the woman called out. "We don't want trouble, but we will take what's ours." Jack's hand went to his rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. His jaw clenched, and his eyes locked onto the leader of the group. Alex could feel the tension in the air, the pulse of danger that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his fear in check. "We don't want trouble either," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with a warning. "We're just trying to get by like everyone else." But the man wasn't convinced. "You've got supplies, don't you?" he sneered, his gaze flicking to the pack slung over Jack's shoulder. "Hand them over. Now." Jack's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Alex thought he might open fire. But then, Jack did something unexpected. He lowered his rifle slightly and took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We don't want to fight," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Take what you need and leave us be." The man hesitated, studying Jack with a look of suspicion. The woman's rifle remained aimed at them, her fingers still on the trigger. Alex's pulse raced in his ears, and for a moment, he feared they might not make it out of this encounter alive. Then, the man let out a low growl and motioned for the group to stand down. "Fine. But don't think this means we're friends. Next time we meet, it won't be so easy." Without another word, the group turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Let's move," Jack said quickly, his voice urgent. "We don't have much time." Alex nodded, still reeling from the encounter. The world was a far more dangerous place than he had ever imagined, and he realized just how thin the line between survival and death truly was. They hadn't made any real friends in this world, they'd only made enemies, and in the end, survival was all that mattered. but for how long could they keep running? The night felt heavier now, the weight of it pressing down on Alex as he followed Jack through the maze of abandoned buildings. The encounter with the survivors had shaken him more than he'd let on. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, and yet it seemed to be the one thing they needed most in this broken world. They had continued moving in silence after the confrontation, the air thick with unspoken tension. Jack's every movement was precise, calculated, as though he was constantly anticipating danger around every corner. His hand never strayed far from his weapon, and his eyes never stopped scanning the environment. Alex had learned quickly that in a world like this, trust was fleeting, and survival was the only rule that mattered. After what felt like an eternity of moving through the labyrinth of decaying city streets, they reached a narrow alleyway lined with tall, crumbling buildings. The air here felt stagnant, thick with dust and the scent of decay. Jack slowed his pace and motioned for Alex to do the same. "This is it," Jack said in a low whisper, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "The old subway tunnels. They're underground, out of sight. They'll give us some time to breathe, maybe even rest for a bit." Alex nodded, his throat tight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the haunting silence that hung in the air, or maybe it was just the fact that they were about to descend into a dark, enclosed space. But he didn't argue. He had learned by now that Jack was usually right, even when it felt like they were heading straight into the unknown. Jack moved first, carefully pulling a rusted metal door open and revealing a set of steep stairs that led downward. The faint smell of damp earth and stale air wafted up from the depths. Alex hesitated for only a moment before following Jack into the darkness. The only light they had was the faint beam of Jack's flashlight, which flickered erratically as they made their way down. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step echoing in the silence. Alex's heart raced as he felt the weight of the city pressing in from all sides. He was starting to feel the oppressive claustrophobia of the tunnels, the sense of being trapped, that there was no way out. But they couldn't afford to turn back. They needed shelter, and the tunnels would have to do for now. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel stretched out before them, a dark, narrow passageway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the bowels of the city. Jack led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a few scattered pieces of old trash and debris. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in layers of grime and mold. It was a far cry from the world they'd known, but it was better than being out in the open where the undead could find them. They moved deeper into the tunnel, their footsteps muffled by the damp floor. The further they went, the quieter it became. Alex's senses were on high alert, his mind constantly on edge, anticipating danger. Every creak of the building above them, every distant noise from the city felt magnified in the stillness of the underground. Jack led them to a small alcove where they could sit down and rest for a moment. He dropped his pack to the floor with a weary sigh, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was finally getting to him. Alex followed suit, sinking down onto the cold, damp floor. "Are you sure this place is safe?" Alex asked, his voice low but filled with doubt. Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "It's safer than the streets above. We just need to stay quiet, stay low. No one else knows about this place. As long as we don't make any noise, we should be fine." Alex nodded, though a sense of unease settled deeper into his bones. He had trusted Jack so far, he had no reason not to, but something about the way Jack had spoken made him question just how safe they were in this underground lair. Was Jack hiding something? Had he been here before, or was he simply hoping that it would be their safe haven? The uncertainty gnawed Alex, but he pushed it aside for the moment. They needed to rest, to recharge. And the tunnels, despite their eerie stillness, were the best option they had right now. After a few minutes of silence, Jack pulled out a small map from his bag and spread it across the floor. The faint light of the flashlight illuminated the worn edges of the map, revealing a series of tunnels that connected various parts of the city. Alex leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the lines and scribbles. "You know where we are?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jack nodded, tracing a line on the map with his finger. "We're near the old subway system. There's an exit on the other side of the city, about 5 miles from here. We can make it there if we don't waste time. Alex felt a twinge of hope. 5 miles wasn't a lot, at least not in the grand scheme of things. They could make it, they just had to stay focused. But then, just as quickly as the hope had risen, a shadow of doubt crept in. Why was Jack so certain about this route? Why hadn't they run into anyone else in these tunnels if it was so well known? The questions kept swirling in Alex's mind, but he fought to push them down. There was no room for doubt. Not now. Let's get some sleep, Jack said, breaking Alex's thoughts. We'll head out in the morning. It'll be safer in the daylight. Alex didn't protest. The fatigue of the past days, the constant stress of staying alive, had taken its toll. He sank back into the cold stone floor, curling up as best as he could in the cramped space. His body ached, and his mind was a storm of thoughts, questions, fears, and memories of what he had lost. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept drifting back to the question of trust. Jack had kept them alive so far, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the world they were in now had no place for trust anymore. And the more time they spent together, the more Alex wondered if Jack was as trustworthy as he appeared. The darkness of the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, swallowing any light or hope that remained. As Alex lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of Jack's breathing, he couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Would they find their way out of the city, or would they be lost, trapped in the shadows of a world gone mad? One thing was certain, the fight for survival was far from over. And in a world full of dangers, there was only one rule: trust no one completely, not even yourself. Morning came slowly, the dim light of the world above barely reaching into the depths of the subway tunnels. Alex awoke with a stiff neck, the cold stone floor biting into his back. The echo of distant trains rumbled through the forgotten tunnels, a reminder of the world that had once been. But there was no longer any sign of life, only the remnants of what was. He stretched, trying to shake off the remnants of a restless sleep. The weight of their situation, the tension that had been growing between him and Jack, seemed to linger in the air, thick and suffocating. Jack was already up, his rifle resting by his side as he studied the map once more, his brow furrowed. The flashlight had long since lost its power, leaving them in near darkness. Jack's flashlight, weak as it was, illuminated only small portions of the map, the paper worn and faded with time. "You're up early," Alex said, his voice rough from sleep. Jack didn't look up, but his lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "There's no such thing as sleep in a place like this. You don't rest. You survive." The cold, harsh truth in his words made Alex feel something shift. It was a reminder of how far removed they were from their old lives, how the world had become unrecognizable, almost alien. Jack had adapted, and Alex hadn't yet fully made peace with what that meant. He wasn't sure he was ready to give up the person he once was in favor of the person the world needed him to be. Alex rubbed his eyes, pushing the disquiet to the back of his mind. "What's the plan?" Jack finally looked up, his eyes hard. "We're close to the exit. We need to move quickly. There's a group of survivors near the surface. They might be a threat, and I don't want to find out what they want." Alex nodded, understanding. Jack's guarded demeanor, the way he always seemed one step ahead of danger, had kept them alive this long. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was hiding something important. It wasn't just the urgency in his voice or the way he always took charge. It was the way Jack never seemed to talk about his past, as though it was something buried deep inside him, something he couldn't, or wouldn't, bring up. As they prepared to leave, Alex noticed a small photo tucked into Jack's bag. It was a faded picture of a woman, a young girl, and Jack standing together. The edges were frayed, the image worn from age, but Alex could make out the faint outlines of smiles. For a moment, he hesitated, caught between curiosity and the urge to respect Jack's privacy. But his questions, the ever-growing suspicion, pushed him to ask. "Who's the girl?" Alex asked, his voice low but curious. Jack stiffened, his hands stilling on the map. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Alex thought he wouldn't. Then, finally, Jack spoke, his voice distant, almost hollow. She was my sister. The woman, my mom. He paused, his face hardening. They didn't make it. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Alex could feel the sorrow behind them, raw and heavy. It was a pain that didn't need to be explained, the kind of loss that didn't need words. Jack was closed off, and Alex had learned not to push too hard, but the tragedy that lived in his eyes was undeniable. Sorry, Alex murmured, his own guilt and regret mingling with the pity he felt. He wished there was something more he could say. But words didn't help anymore. They never did. Jack nodded, but his face remained unreadable. He wasn't interested in sympathy, not from Alex or anyone. They had too much to do to dwell on the past. The two of them moved out of the alcove and continued down the tunnel. As they walked, the light from the flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows against the cracked concrete walls. The underground system seemed endless, twisting and turning in on itself, a labyrinth of decay. But there was a sense of finality in the air. They had to keep moving, to push forward toward whatever was left of their world. As they approached the end of the tunnel, the faint light of daybreak reached them. The exit, once a hopeful symbol of escape, now felt like a doorway into something far worse. The streets above were just as dangerous as the underground, if not more so. The city was no longer a place of life, it was a war zone, with both the living and the dead fighting for survival. Jack stopped at the top of the stairs, listening intently. The city was eerily quiet, too quiet. The wind howled through the streets above them, but there were no sounds of life. No cars, no distant chatter, no footfalls. "This is it," Jack said, his voice low and cautious. "Stay close. We don't know what's waiting up there." They climbed the stairs, each step a reminder of what had been lost. As they emerged from the tunnel and into the open air, Alex felt a sudden pang of relief, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of danger. The streets before them were desolate, the buildings towering in silent ruin. But the world wasn't empty. The undead roamed the streets, shuffling aimlessly, as though they were drawn to something. But it wasn't just the undead that made Alex's stomach twist with fear. It was the sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Voices. "There are survivors," Alex whispered, his heart pounding. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. His grip on his rifle tightened. "We need to move. Now." They ducked behind a nearby building, their movements quick and silent. The survivors were further down the street, and from what Alex could see, they were armed, dangerous. Alex felt his pulse quicken as Jack led them through the shadows, always keeping a step ahead of the threat. As they rounded a corner, Jack stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. He turned to Alex, his expression stern. "I need you to do exactly as I say. Do not speak. Do not make a sound." Alex nodded, his nerves on edge as they crouched low behind a wrecked car. The voices grew louder, closer now. Alex's breath caught in his throat, and he strained to make out the words. But it was no use. The air was thick with tension, and every nerve in his body was telling him to run, to get away. But Jack's calm presence steadied him. Jack was always in control. Always. "Stay with me," Jack murmured, as they crouched in the shadows, their fate uncertain. The fight for survival was never over. There was always something lurking, always something to fear. In a world like this, nothing was ever safe for long. And no one could be trusted, least of all themselves. The quiet, tense moments stretched between them like the calm before a storm. The distant murmur of the survivors' voices grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the abandoned streets. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low behind the wrecked car, every muscle taut with anticipation. Jack's eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in front of them, his expression steely and unreadable. The group of survivors was getting closer, and they were armed, more heavily than Alex would have liked. "Stay low," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "We can't risk being seen." Alex nodded, doing his best to control his breathing. His mind raced, replaying the countless encounters they'd had with other survivors, encounters that hadn't always gone well. Trust was a fragile thing in this new world, and the slightest mistake could turn the tide from an ally to an enemy. Alex didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but he knew one thing for certain: they were dangerous. The survivors were now only a few yards away, moving in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced precision. Their weapons were slung over their shoulders, but they weren't taking any chances. They were looking for threats, and if they found one, Alex didn't doubt for a second that they'd act without hesitation. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, and Alex couldn't help but notice the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Jack had always been calm under pressure, but now he seemed different. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something Alex couldn't quite place. "We don't engage unless we have to," Jack said, as if reading Alex's mind. "We need information. Nothing else." Alex barely had time to respond before a loud noise shattered the silence. A crash, followed by the unmistakable growl of the undead. It came from the direction of the survivors. The group froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. The undead had arrived, shuffling aimlessly toward the noise, drawn by the scent of the living. The survivors immediately shifted into combat mode, their eyes narrowing as they raised their weapons, ready to deal with the threat. "What do we do?" Alex asked, panic starting to creep into his voice. The sight of the undead moving in their direction made his skin crawl, the ever-present fear of being swarmed by them gnawing at his mind. "Stay down. Wait for the right moment," Jack replied, his voice low and steady. The undead, mindless and hungry, slowly approached the survivors. There was no strategy in their movements, just a singular drive for flesh. The survivors fired in quick succession, each shot ringing out in the still air, echoing through the desolate streets. The zombies dropped one by one, but more kept coming, and the noise was attracting even more. It was chaos. The survivors were doing their best to keep the horde at bay, but it was clear they weren't going to be able to hold out much longer. The zombies were relentless, pouring in from every direction. The survivors had no choice but to retreat, falling back to a more defensible position. "We need to go," Jack muttered under his breath. "Now." Without another word, he grabbed Alex by the arm and yanked him away from their hiding spot. They sprinted down the alley, keeping low to avoid detection. Alex's legs burned with each step, but he pushed himself harder, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The sound of gunfire and screaming echoed behind them, but they didn't dare look back. They reached the next block and ducked into an abandoned building, breathing heavily as they tried to catch their breath. The chaos outside continued, but for now, they were safe. Alex's mind was racing. What had just happened? They had been so close to the survivors, so close to making contact. But now, they had only narrowly escaped the madness. He glanced at Jack, whose face was unreadable, but Alex could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness in his movements. "You didn't want to help them," Alex said, his voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You just let them fight for their lives while we ran." Jack's eyes flicked to Alex, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You don't understand. That group," he paused, his words hanging in the air. "They're not who they appear to be. They have their own agenda. And it doesn't involve helping anyone but themselves." Alex's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? How do you know that?" Jack turned away, his gaze settling on the distant skyline through the broken window. "I've seen their kind before. They're dangerous, Alex. And if we got involved, we'd only be putting ourselves in more danger." Alex's mind spun as he processed Jack's words. The survivors had been in trouble, sure, but how did Jack know so much about them? And why had he been so quick to dismiss the idea of helping them? There was something about Jack's reaction that unsettled him. It was more than just caution, it was something deeper, something hidden. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alex asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Jack's eyes met his, cold and hard. "Because you wouldn't have understood. You're too idealistic. You think the world is still the way it was before, that there's some kind of order to this chaos. But there's no room for that anymore. People only care about themselves. You can't afford to trust anyone. Alex's chest tightened, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. He had always believed that survival meant staying human, that it meant holding on to the principles that made them who they were. But now, in this world, Jack's words felt like a harsh truth, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. But before he could respond, a distant noise interrupted their conversation, a low rumble, followed by the unmistakable screech of tires. "They're coming," Jack said, his tone clipped. "We need to move. Now." They didn't wait for another second. They grabbed their bags and weapons, rushing through the building, away from whatever danger was headed their way. But as they exited into the back alley, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's trust, or lack of it, was becoming the biggest threat of all. They were being hunted. And this time, it wasn't the undead they had to fear. It was the living. The streets outside were alive with movement, but it wasn't the zombies that now dominated the city. The sound of tires screeching against cracked asphalt echoed through the streets as a heavily armed convoy of survivors roared into view. The vehicles, a mix of battered trucks and jeeps, came to a screeching halt just a few yards from the building Alex and Jack had just exited. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He could see their faces, determined and hardened. They were survivors, yes, but they were also something else, something darker. They were the kind of people Jack had warned him about. "We need to get out of here, now," Jack said urgently, grabbing Alex's arm and pulling him toward a narrow side street. But it was too late. The convoy's doors swung open with a loud thud, and figures clad in makeshift armor and armed to the teeth began pouring out. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them, another survivor from the group they had seen earlier. The woman with the rifle, the one who had been shouting orders to the others. She spotted them almost instantly. "There they are," she screamed. "The ones who ran." The others immediately began moving toward them, weapons raised, their eyes full of hostility. Alex's pulse surged, fear gripping him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a power struggle, about control over what little was left of this world. "Jack, what are we going to do?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. His hand clenched around his own rifle, but he didn't feel prepared. Not for this. Jack's jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes flicked toward the alleyways around them. The chance of escape was growing slimmer by the second. "We fight," he said flatly. "We can't outrun them now." They were cornered. The convoy had them surrounded. Alex tried to take a deep breath, but the oppressive air made it feel impossible. Jack had always been calm, always in control. But now, even Jack was showing signs of tension. The woman and her group were closing in fast, their eyes full of anger and suspicion. "Why'd you run, huh?" the woman shouted, her voice echoing through the alley. "You think you're better than us? You think you can survive without us?" "We don't want any trouble," Alex called out, his voice shaky but resolute. "We're just trying to get through this, like everyone else." But the woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Too bad. Trouble's already found you." With a swift movement, she raised her rifle and pointed it at Alex. Jack was quicker. His rifle was up and aimed in an instant, his eyes locked on hers with unwavering focus. The tension between the two survivors was palpable, thick as the air around them. Alex's heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he thought it would give him away. But Jack didn't fire. He didn't make a move to strike first. "Put it down, now," Jack commanded, his voice cold and unwavering. The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the rifle. Behind her, the rest of the group followed suit, weapons raised, waiting for an order. "You think you can intimidate us?" she sneered. "We're just as desperate as you are. But we're stronger." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Alex could feel the tension building, the conflict between wanting to survive and needing to stay human, to not lose himself completely in the chaos. But survival, Jack had said, didn't allow for idealism. In this new world, everything had a price, and sometimes, the price of survival was too high. But just as Alex opened his mouth to respond, a sudden, shrill scream pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet, the undead. The woman's eyes widened in panic, and her group began to turn, their attention snapping toward the street. A horde of zombies had appeared from the shadows, drawn by the noise, the gunfire, the chaos. The woman cursed under her breath. "This is your fault," she yelled at Alex and Jack. "Now we're all going to die." She fired into the approaching zombies, and the rest of the convoy followed suit, unleashing a barrage of bullets. The undead fell in droves, but more kept coming, and it wasn't enough. The group was becoming overwhelmed. Panic set in. The world was crumbling faster than anyone had anticipated. "Move, now!" Jack barked, pulling Alex toward a nearby building. They sprinted through the alley, but Alex could hear the chaos behind them, the screams of survivors and the growls of the undead mingling into a terrible symphony. The group had become disorganized, their attention divided between the threat of the living and the dead. The sounds of battle faded as Alex and Jack rounded another corner, the immediate danger of the convoy behind them. But the truth remained, this city was no longer a place where anyone could survive on their own. The two of them slowed to a stop in a nearby courtyard, panting heavily. The world had turned upside down, and they had just barely escaped the worst of it. Jack glanced at Alex, his face grim. "This isn't over," Jack said quietly. "There's no escaping it now." Alex could feel the weight of Jack's words. There was no safety, no clear path forward. There was only survival, and it would come at whatever cost necessary. The future was uncertain, and trust, once a bond between people, was now a currency too precious to spend. There were no allies left in the world, only people willing to fight for whatever scraps of life they could still cling to. And in this unforgiving world, survival was the only thing that mattered. As they disappeared into the shadows of the city, one thing was clear: the fight for survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. And for Alex and Jack, there was no way to know who, or what, would be the next threat in a world where everyone was locked in a battle for their very existence.